A Vietnamese platoon guide steps into a Khmer Rouge trench at dawn and finds rice still steaming in a dented pot, Chinese stenciled ammunition crates stacked neatly against the earthen wall, the owners having fled moments earlier into the jungle mist. This is not the war you know. For a decade after Saigon fell, the world believed Southeast Asia had finally found peace. But along the unmarked border between Vietnam and democratic Kampuchea, a different kind of hell was brewing, one that would drag Hanoi into a lightning invasion, topple one of history's most murderous regimes, and trap Vietnamese soldiers in a decade-long occupation that smelled of palm sugar and decay. What began as border raids escalated into a full-scale war that nobody wanted to call a war, fought by exhausted troops who thought they'd already paid their dues in blood. By the spring and summer of 1977, Khmer Rouge forces were crossing the border with methodical brutality. At least 30 Vietnamese hamlets in An Giang, Quyen Giang and Tay Ninh provinces felt the bite of these incursions. Provincial reports logged the grim arithmetic. Hundreds of villagers killed, water buffalo driven off as war booty, entire communities left smoking. The raids followed a pattern, swift, vicious, designed to terrorize. Families who had survived the American war now faced machetes and Chinese Type 56 rifles in the pre-dawn darkness, their livestock stolen, their homes torched, their bodies left in the paddies for the sun to bloat. The violence reached a horrifying crescendo on April 18th through 30th, 1978, when Khmer Rouge forces swept through Bachuk in An Giang province. What happened there would become seared into Vietnamese memory. 3,100 civilians died. Survivors who crawled from the carnage described monks' bodies piled in the Tambu pagoda, walls blackened by burning straw mats, the smell of charred flesh mixing with incense that still smouldered on abandoned altars. The massacre wasn't combat, it was extermination. Old men, children, pregnant women, none were spared. The Khmer Rouge treated the border not as a line on a map, but as a license for butchery. Hanoi's military planners watched these reports stack up on their desks and made cold calculations. By mid-1978, intelligence estimated that democratic Kampuchea fielded 70 to 80,000 main force troops along the frontier. They were armed with Chinese Type 56 rifles, RPG-7 rocket launchers, 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns, and 107mm rockets. The Khmer Rouge weren't bandits. They were a standing army with backing from Beijing, and they were testing Hanoi's resolve with every raid. Vietnam began assembling a strike force unlike anything it had mobilized since the fall of Saigon. 3 main corps formed the spine, 2nd Corps under the name Hongjiang, 4th Corps designated Q Long, and 5th Corps, supplemented by independent divisions including the battle-hardened 7th, 9th, 302nd, and 315th. The total force ranged somewhere between 120,000 and 200,000 troops, though exact figures remain disputed among historians. These weren't fresh recruits. Many had fought the French, then the Americans, then mopped up resistance in the south. Now they were being asked to march again. On November 3rd, 1978, Vietnam signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Within weeks, the sky over Gia Lam and Noi Bai airfields filled with the thunder of Soviet Il-76 and An-22 cargo planes. They came loaded with ammunition, radios, spare parts, everything Hanoi needed to sustain a cross-border offensive. Moscow was placing its bet, and the chips were being stacked on Vietnamese airstrips in crates stenciled with Cyrillic script. December brought the dry season, average highs of 30 to 32 degrees Celsius, low rainfall, and most critically firm laterite roads. The monsoon mud that had swallowed so many operations in previous wars was gone, replaced by hard-packed earth that could support T-54 tanks and loaded supply trucks. Still, engineers worked around the clock laying pierced steel planking over swampy sections in the plain of reeds, throwing pontoon bridges across canals, smoothing the path for an army on the move. On December 2nd, 1978, 2 Cambodian defectors named Heng Samrin and Chea Sim stood in a rubber tap camp near Snuol and announced the formation of the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation. Hanoi immediately framed it as a Cambodian-led movement, a homegrown resistance that just happened to need Vietnamese military support. The political theatre was necessary. Vietnam couldn't be seen as an invader, even as it massed divisions on the border. The KU-FNs would provide the fig leaf for what was about to unfold. 23 days later, on December 25, 1978, at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, Vietnamese artillery batteries along 3 main axes opened fire. Route 1 pointed toward Nek Luong and Phnom Penh. Route 7 aimed for Kratie and Kompong Cham. Route 13 and Route 19 targeted Siem Reap and Battambang. The invasion had begun, though Hanoi would never call it that. Officially, this was a counter-offensive to protect Vietnamese sovereignty. Unofficially, it was the opening salvo of a war that would last a decade and consume a generation of soldiers who thought they were finally done with war. Imagine yourself in that trench at dawn, steam rising from abandoned rice, the jungle alive with the rustle of retreat, and somewhere in the distance the first rumble of tanks rolling forward. Vietnamese 2nd Corps Armour Commander watches through his cupola as a PT-76 amphibious tank churns across a canal, its wake slapping against banana trees, while somewhere ahead a Khmer Rouge bunker, nested in an earthen dike, waits with a loaded RPG-7. The opening artillery barrage had torn the pre-dawn silence apart, but now came the harder work, closing the distance, clearing the bunkers, taking ground meter by bloody meter. The Khmer Rouge had turned geography itself into a weapon, transforming irrigation dikes into fortified positions, seeding roads with Chinese Type 72 mines and homemade wooden box traps that could gut a truck or shred a man's legs without prejudice. For the Vietnamese troops rolling across the border, this would be no parade march to Phnom Penh. Every kilometre would be earned. 2nd Corps brought the heaviest punch, T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks, their diesel engines growling as they lurched over rutted tracks, PT-76 light tanks that could swim rivers and canals, BTR-60 armoured personnel carriers crammed with infantry who sweated in the metal ovens. Behind them came the artillery train, 85mm and 122mm field guns, D-44 and D-30 models, that could punch through the packed earth bunkers the Khmer Rouge favoured. Vietnamese doctrine had always married firepower to manoeuvre, and now they applied both with methodical violence. Riverine units pushed up the Mekong and Bassac in steel-hulled patrol boats, twin 23mm cannons mounted on the bows. Crews slept under canvas tarps stretched over the decks, their heads inches from gasoline drums that baked in the sun and filled the air with petrochemical stink. At night they anchored mid-river, engines cut, listening to the jungle breathe and watching for the telltale ripples that might signal swimmers with limpet mines. The rivers were highways and battlefields both, carrying supplies forward and wounded back, their brown water indifferent to the blood that occasionally darkened its surface. Many of the infantry wore rubber Ho Chi Minh sandals cut from old truck tires, the same footwear that had carried them down the Ho Chi Minh Trail years before. They stuffed extra AK magazines into canvas pouches scavenged from American War-era depots in the South, gear that had outlasted the enemy who'd issued it. Some pouches still bore faded US Army stamps. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, using American equipment to fight a Chinese-backed regime in Cambodia. Southeast Asia's wars had a way of recycling themselves. The Khmer Rouge contested every approach. They mined the roads with discipline, burying Type 72 anti-tank mines in the laterite and wooden box improvised devices in the softer shoulders. Vietnamese sapper teams moved ahead of the columns with Bangalore torpedoes and long bamboo poles tipped with bayonets, probing the verges like blind men feeling for tripwires. It was slow, nerve-shredding work. One wrong probe and the blast would leave a crater and scattered pieces of whoever had been unlucky. The sappers smoked continuously, not from nerves but to keep the mosquitoes off while they crouched in the dirt and played their deadly game of touch and guess. Civilians along the border watched the convoys roll past, uncertain whether to flee or stay. They boiled river water in blackened kettles, the smell of fish sauce and fermented prahock mixing with diesel fumes as ox carts creaked to the roadside to let the T-54s thunder by. Some villages had been caught in the crossfire of the border raids, their allegiances uncertain, their survival instincts telling them to bow to whoever had the most guns pointed their way at any given moment. Women hid rice in false floors. Men buried what tools they had left. Children stared at the tanks with wide eyes, trying to memorize a sight they'd tell their grandchildren about, if they lived that long. Between January 1st and 3rd, 1979, Vietnamese forces seized Kratie and Kompong Cham after sharp firefights around the concrete bridges on Route 7. The Khmer Rouge had tried to demolish the spans, but the charges either failed or were only partially successful, leaving twisted rebar and cracked pylons that could still bear weight. Engineers anchored ribbon bridges with 55-gallon drums when the main piers were blown, creating floating platforms that swayed sickeningly under the weight of armour, but held long enough for the tanks to cross single file, crews praying the whole contraption wouldn't collapse mid-span and drop them into the current. Vietnamese MiG-21 fighters flew limited overflights, their presence more symbolic than decisive. The real aerial work came from Mi-8 and Mi-17 helicopters, lifting sapper teams deep behind Khmer Rouge lines to cut supply routes and mining trails. The choppers came in low and fast, side gunners scanning the tree line while the pilots wrestled with thermals that turned the cockpit into a convection oven. They'd hover just long enough for the sappers to jump, then peel away as small arms fire crackled from below. Some helicopters came back with bullet holes punched through the tail boom. Some didn't come back at all. Khmer Rouge communications relied on runners and hand-cranked field telephones, technology that belonged to an earlier war but proved maddeningly effective in the jungle, where radio signals died in the canopy. Vietnamese signals units deployed R-105 and R-123 radios, stringing wire along tamarind fences to connect regimental command posts. The technological mismatch didn't guarantee victory. Sometimes the side with simpler gear adapted faster, while the side with radios spent precious minutes trying to restore a connection that enemy fire had just severed. In an abandoned Khmer Rouge aid post outside Kompong Cham, a Vietnamese medic pushed through the doorway and catalogued what he found in his log. No scalpels, only razor blades, a bottle labelled salt water, a ledger listing malaria, 37 cases. The poverty of the medical infrastructure told its own story about the regime the Vietnamese were fighting, a revolution that had stripped itself down to bone and sinew, sacrificing even basic humanity in pursuit of ideological purity. The medic pocketed the ledger, wondering if anyone back in Hanoi would believe what he'd seen. On January 5th and 6th, a Vietnamese naval detachment landed near Kompong Som, what the French had called Sihanoukville. They came ashore expecting resistance but found the port silent. Cranes frozen mid-swing. Sacks of rice split open on the wharf, grain spilling into oily puddles, gulls shrieking and wheeling overhead, the only movement in a tableau of abandonment. The Khmer Rouge had pulled back inland, ceding the coast without a fight, and the Vietnamese sailors walked through the empty warehouses with a growing sense of unease. Picture yourself on that swaying ribbon bridge, 55-gallon drums groaning under your tank's weight, the river sliding past below, and the far bank still holding who knows what in the tree line. Forward elements of 4th Corps crossed the Monivong Bridge into Phnom Penh at 8:30 in the morning on January 7th, 1979, and find a city that feels like it died in its sleep. Dark offices, typewriters dusted with grime, the hum of unattended generators droning through abandoned ministries. The silence was wrong. Cities don't go quiet like this, not even in war. There should have been gunfire, last-ditch resistance, barricades manned by fanatics willing to die for the revolution. Instead, the Vietnamese infantry moved through empty boulevards past shuttered shopfronts and government buildings, where paperwork still sat on desks, as if the clerks had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. The eerie absence of people turned Phnom Penh into a stage set, all props and no actors, waiting for a performance that had been cancelled. Patrols fanned out through the districts, boots echoing on tile floors, weapons at the ready for an ambush that never came. In one ministry building, soldiers found filing cabinets pulled open, documents scattered across the floor in a hurried evacuation. A calendar on the wall was still turned to December. In another office, a cup of tea sat on a windowsill, a film of mould growing across its surface. The city hadn't been fought over. It had been abandoned, surrendered to the invaders, without a shot fired in its defence. The markets began reopening within days, a spontaneous resurrection that surprised even the Vietnamese command. Charcoal smoke rose from cooking fires. Mounds of dried fish appeared on makeshift stalls. Women traded rice by the milk can, using old condensed milk tins as measuring cups, bartering and haggling in Khmer, while Vietnamese soldiers watched from street corners, uncertain whether to intervene or let commerce resurrect itself. The city was coming back to life, cell by cell, as people emerged from wherever they'd been hiding during the Khmer Rouge years. The countryside, the forests, the margins of survival. Vietnamese logistics units commandeered Peugeot trucks abandoned by the fleeing regime, French-made vehicles with cracked windshields and engines that coughed black smoke but still ran. They used them for ration runs, hauling sacks of rice and crates of ammunition through streets where ox carts now competed with military convoys. The juxtaposition was jarring. Revolutionary soldiers in a city that was simultaneously medieval and modern, starving and resilient, dead and clawing its way back to some semblance of life. Then the patrols found Tuol Sleng. The compound sat in a quiet neighbourhood, unremarkable from the outside, just another cluster of buildings behind a wall. But when Vietnamese soldiers pushed through the gates, they walked into a bureaucratized hell. Leg irons bolted to iron bed frames, floor tiles stained dark brown where blood had soaked in and never been cleaned, thousands upon thousands of mugshot negatives, filed with meticulous care, each prisoner photographed before interrogation, their faces capturing the moment they realized there would be no escape. The darkroom still smelled of chemical developer trays, that sharp, acrid tang mixing with something worse underneath, the residue of human decay that no amount of lime could fully erase. One soldier later described walking through the cells and feeling his stomach turn, not from the physical evidence of torture, though that was everywhere, but from the sheer administrative precision of it all. The Khmer Rouge hadn't just killed people, they'd catalogued them, numbered them, filed them away like inventory in a warehouse of death. It was genocide as paperwork, extermination as record-keeping. S-21 had processed somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000 prisoners. Fewer than a dozen survived. The Vietnamese command immediately understood the propaganda value of Tuol Sleng. Photographers were dispatched, film crews arrived. The mugshots would be shown to the world as evidence of what the invasion had stopped, proof that Vietnam had liberated Cambodia rather than conquered it. Whether the world would believe that narrative was another question, but the evidence was undeniable. This regime had eaten its own people with industrial efficiency. Meanwhile, the Khmer Rouge leadership was fracturing westward. Pol Pot's voice reappeared on radio broadcasts weeks later, railing about betrayal and Vietnamese aggression from somewhere in the Dangrek Mountains along the Thai border. His units had melted into the escarpments around Pai Lin, Viel Reng, and An Long Veng, regrouping in jungle sanctuaries where they'd wage guerrilla war for years to come. The regime hadn't been destroyed. It had simply changed form, trading conventional warfare for insurgency, cities for forests, manifestos for ambushes. In the first month of fighting, Vietnam claimed to have captured or destroyed 20,000 Khmer Rouge troops and seized massive stockpiles, 122mm rockets, 82mm mortars, ammunition dumps that suggested the regime had been preparing for a much longer war. Casualty totals remain disputed among historians. The Vietnamese figures were almost certainly inflated for domestic consumption, the Khmer Rouge numbers unknowable given their collapse. The truth lay somewhere in the smoke and confusion, buried with the bodies that were never properly counted. A Pavan engineer company parked a T-54 on the lawn of the National Museum overnight, needing a defensible position while they secured the block. At dawn, a squad found themselves staring at a 12th century sandstone guardian statue, its serene face gazing at the tank's dented glacis plate with what one soldier later described as disapproval from the old kings. The ancient and modern, locked in silent judgment, stone outlasting steel, empires rising and falling while the statues watched with eternal patience. Cholera and dysentery flared in the weeks after the takeover, diseases of displacement and contaminated water that hit civilians and soldiers alike. Vietnamese medical units moved through neighborhoods chlorinating wells with standard 2 to 5 parts per million treatments, issuing chloroquine tablets for falciparum malaria, spraying DDT in longhouses despite the chemical's acrid bite that made eyes water and throats close. The smell of disinfectant became the smell of occupation, a sharp chemical promise that the new order would at least try to keep people alive. Propaganda vans with roof-mounted loudspeakers rolled through districts at dusk, looping statements written by Heng Samrin's cadres and promising amnesty for Khmer Rouge soldiers who surrendered. The tinny speech echoed over palm groves, competing with the evening cicadas, offering reconciliation in a country that had forgotten what the word meant. Some fighters laid down their weapons, most kept walking toward Thailand. On January 10, 1979, Hanoi formally installed the People's Republic of Kampuchea with Heng Samrin as head of state and Pen Sovan in a key ministerial role, later replaced by Chair Sim and eventually Hun Sen as the political landscape solidified. Vietnamese advisors nested in each ministry like cuckoo birds, assisting with decisions that were really directives, their presence a daily reminder that Cambodia's independence was theoretical at best. Imagine walking through Tuol Sleng's cells, the afternoon light slanting through barred windows, and realizing that the people in those mugshots are staring at you across time, asking a question you can't answer. PAVN garrisons fortify provincial towns with sandbagged intersections and heavy machine guns mounted on French-era balconies, while curfew sirens wail at 9 o'clock each night, and patrols rotate by sampan along canals that reek of sewage and rotting vegetables. The war had shifted. The lightning invasion was over, the regime toppled, Phnom Penh occupied. Now came the harder part, holding what had been taken, pacifying a countryside that had never been fully controlled, hunting guerrillas who knew every trail and tunnel. Vietnamese soldiers who had expected to march home as liberators instead found themselves settling into garrison duty, digging in for what would become a decade-long occupation that ground men down, not with single catastrophic battles, but with the slow attrition of ambushes, mines, and tropical disease. Along Route 5 toward Battambang, Vietnamese convoys averaged 20 to 25 kilometers per hour, crawling forward as engineers filled in demolished culverts and reinforced bridges the Khmer Rouge had tried to drop. Drivers tied palm fronds to truck grills to break the sun's glare, the green branches wilting in the heat but providing just enough shade to keep the windshields from becoming blinding mirrors. Joss sticks hung from rear-view mirrors for luck, their sweet smoke mixing with diesel fumes, a Buddhist hedge against landmines and rocket-propelled grenades. One night, Khmer Rouge harassing fire hit a rice depot outside Battambang. A 122mm rocket buried itself nose first into stacked grain sacks and failed to explode, leaving a green metal cylinder jutting from the white rice like a deadly bamboo shoot. Engineers spent an entire morning carefully extracting it, while the depot workers watched from a safe distance, smoking cigarettes and placing bets on whether the whole pile would go up. It didn't. The rocket was diffused, the rice distributed, and life continued with the peculiar fatalism that occupying soldiers develop when death becomes routine. Then China attacked. On February 17, 1979, approximately 200,000 Chinese troops surged across Vietnam's northern frontier in what Beijing called a punitive expedition and Hanoi called an invasion. The timing was deliberate, punishment for Vietnam's move into Cambodia, a message from China's leadership that there were consequences for defying their Khmer Rouge clients. The war lasted 27 days of brutal mountain fighting that left border towns devastated and casualty list climbing on both sides. From the Cambodian front, Hanoi was forced to divert logistics officers and artillery shells northward, stripping supplies from units that were already operating on thin margins. But the major formations stayed in place. Vietnam was now fighting a two-front war, holding Cambodia with one hand while fending off China with the other, a strategic nightmare that stretched resources to breaking point. The soldiers in Cambodia heard about the northern fighting through letters from home and radio broadcasts, wondering if they'd be recalled, if their units would be the ones pulled back to defend Lang Son or Cao Bang. Most weren't. They stayed in Cambodia, reading between the lines of official statements and understanding that they'd been left to finish what they'd started. ASEAN foreign ministers condemned the Vietnamese invasion and occupation in formal resolutions that meant little to the soldiers on the ground, but everything to the diplomatic isolation Hanoi was sliding into. Thailand's border posts at places like Aranyaprathet became lifelines for the Khmer Rouge and other resistance factions, safe havens where they could rearm, regroup and recruit. The border turned porous, a grey zone where Khmer Rouge guerrillas, royalist forces loyal to Prince Sihanouk, and Republican fighters formed uneasy coalitions united only by their opposition to the Vietnamese-backed PRK. Vietnamese patrols on the Tonle Sap used PT-76 light tanks as makeshift ferries, towing wooden skiffs loaded with refugees across the lake's brown water. The afternoon wind chopped waves against the steel hulls, slapping algae onto turret rings and soaking the refugees huddled in the boats. Soldiers watched the shoreline for ambushes while trying not to think too hard about what would happen if a mine or RPG caught them mid-lake. The PT-76 could swim, but not with a boatload of civilians tied to its stern. Khmer Rouge guerrillas adapted their tactics, relying increasingly on command-detonated mines rigged with battery and wire mechanisms hidden in biscuit tins or bamboo containers. Vietnamese trawling teams developed countermeasures, dragging grapnels on long cords ahead of advancing columns, collecting snags of wire and occasionally tiger-tooth amulets that someone had worn for protection before the mine killed them anyway. It was slow work that turned every patrol into a nerve-shredding crawl, waiting for the blast that might or might not come. Pavan supply tables planned 600 to 700 grams of rice per soldier per day, a ration that was supposed to sustain men marching and fighting in tropical heat. Field cooks stretched it with whatever they could scavenge: pumpkin, morning glory greens, dried snake meat that had to be soaked before cooking. Fish sauce rations might be 20 to 30 millilitres, that sour sweet funk clinging to mess tins long after the meal was finished. Men lost weight, uniforms hung loose, letters home mentioned hunger in careful euphemisms that wouldn't alarm the censors. In Kompong Tom, a Vietnamese squad entered a pagoda to bivouac for the night, and found Buddhist murals freshly overpainted. The Buddha's eyes had been replaced with black crosses. The floor was scattered with broken arms bowls, smashed deliberately, the fragments crunching underfoot. It was ideological vandalism, the Khmer Rouge's attempt to erase religion itself, and the soldiers stood in that defaced sacred space, feeling a kind of second-hand violation. Some were Buddhist, some weren't. All of them understood desecration when they saw it. Vietnamese advisors embedded with the new PRK police trained them to register households block by block. Each house received a hand-painted number and an entry in a ledger listing occupants, rice stocks, and occupation. It was surveillance disguised as administration, a system borrowed from Vietnam's own security apparatus and transplanted to Cambodia. The advisors spoke through interpreters, teaching methods that had kept Hanoi's grip firm in the south, and hoping they'd work just as well here. Soviet-supplied ZIL fuel trucks ran the 240-kilometre route from Tai Ninh to Phnom Penh, their cargo tanks sloshing with thin gasoline cut with kerosene that made engines sputter and mechanics curse. Drivers taped lucky red cloth to bumper irons and developed superstitions about which roads were safe and which stretched attracted ambushes. Some convoys made it through untouched. Some came back with bullet-riddled cabs and dead drivers slumped over steering wheels. Refugee flows surged through 1979, hundreds of thousands moving toward Thai camps like Khao Dang, fleeing the chaos of regime change and famine. Vietnamese field kitchens set up at crossroads, ladling thin pumpkin porridge into whatever containers people carried. Tin cans, coconut shells, cupped hands. It was charity and control both, an attempt to manage the human flood and keep it from overwhelming the fragile new order. Khmer Rouge propaganda accused Vietnam of swallowing Kampuchea, turning Cambodia into a colony, erasing its identity. Hanoi countered with photographs of the skull pits at Choeong Ek and the intake notebooks from Tuol Sleng, evidence that whatever Vietnam's motives, they'd stopped a genocide. The propaganda war raged in international forums while in Cambodia itself. The reality was more complex, neither pure liberation nor pure conquest, but something messier that defied easy categorization. Imagine yourself in that pagoda at dusk, the defaced Buddha watching with crossed-out eyes, and wondering what kind of revolution destroys its own gods. Vietnamese infantry go barefoot inside villages to move silently on plank floors, rubbing mosquito coils along trouser cuffs at night, and using cigarette embers as wordless signals when hand gestures disappear in the dark. The war had settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite combat, a low-intensity grind that killed more slowly than the invasion, but just as surely. By 1980, the occupation had calcified into routine. Units rotated through forward outposts at places like Osmak, An Long Veng, and Pailin, facing Khmer Rouge mortars positioned 600 to 800 meters away in the jungle. Soldiers served 3 to 6 month rotations before being pulled back, many reporting jungle foot, flesh rotting between the toes from constant moisture, and web gear that decomposed faster than it could be replaced. The guerrillas owned the night. Vietnamese troops learned to register harassing artillery fires on suspected trail networks at 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, disrupting enemy movement without ever seeing the targets. By dawn, the jungle smelled of damp cordite and crushed lemongrass, where gun crews brewed tea over small fires, the bitter drink cutting through the chemical residue coating their throats. The routine became mechanical: prep the guns, fire the mission, clean the bores, wait for the next night's coordinates. Civil military teams moved through Kandal and Takeo provinces, repairing irrigation dikes that the Khmer Rouge had either neglected or deliberately destroyed. The first new rice harvests in 1980 were disappointing, yields around 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare, barely subsistence level, the result of shattered canal systems and a catastrophic shortage of water buffalo. The animals had been slaughtered for meat during the Khmer Rouge years, or driven off in border raids, leaving farmers to pull ploughs themselves or leave fields unplanted. Vietnamese engineers showed locals how to rebuild the earthworks, but you couldn't rebuild livestock or lost agricultural knowledge overnight. A demining dog named Vang, Yellow in Vietnamese, was credited by one platoon's diary with 23 mine finds in 3 months. The soldiers fed him sticky rice balls dipped in fish sauce as rewards, the dog's tail wagging even as he circled another buried explosive that could have erased half a squad. Animals adapted to war better than humans sometimes. Vang didn't dream about the mines he'd found. He just ate his rice and waited for the next patrol. Hanoi insisted publicly that Vietnam had been invited by the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation and the PRK government, that the occupation was really assistance freely given between socialist brothers. At the United Nations, however, Democratic Kampuchea retained Cambodia's seat through the 1980s, a diplomatic absurdity that baffled many Vietnamese line officers. They were dying to prop up a government the world refused to recognize, while the regime they'd toppled still represented Cambodia in international forums. The disconnect between battlefield reality and diplomatic theatre was complete. Ethnic Vietnamese families who had fled Cambodia during the 1975 to 1978 period began returning under PRK protection, settling back into river hamlets where they'd lived for generations. Guards posted at these settlements lit mosquito smokers at dusk, coils that gave campfires a sweet, bitter smell and kept the insects at bay while families tried to resume lives that had been interrupted by genocide. The returnees were often viewed with suspicion by ethnic Khmers, who saw them as collaborators with the occupation. Old resentments festered beneath the surface calm. Chinese rockets and Thai-sourced munitions kept the Khmer Rouge guerrillas supplied. Pavan patrols in 1982 found new plastic-wrapped 7.62mm ammunition with Thai factory codes, evidence of supply chains that ran through Bangkok and beyond. Historians debate the exact mechanisms. How much came directly from China? How much was funneled through Thailand? How much represented stockpiles versus fresh production? But the result was undeniable. The resistance had staying power because it had external backing that Vietnam couldn't interdict. Vietnamese units carried laminated phrase sheets with basic Khmer commands. Drop your weapon, come here. Numbers, days of the week. Interpreters were recruited from southern Mekong communities, where Vietnamese and Khmer populations had mixed for centuries, but even fluent speakers struggled with rural dialects and the cultural gulf between occupier and occupied. Language was just another barrier in a war full of them. The ruins at Angkor Wat became a rear area waypoint, a place where soldiers could catch their breath between rotations. Vietnamese troops posed for snapshots on Naga balustrades, grinning in front of temple spires that had outlasted a dozen empires and would outlast this one too. Sappers fenced minefields around the complex with white cloth and scavenged radio wire, trying to preserve what the war hadn't yet destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, protecting ancient Khmer glory while fighting Khmer guerrillas who saw the Vietnamese as the latest in a long line of foreign invaders. During a night-firing exercise near Kompong Spur, an artillery battery startled a colony of fruit bats roosting in nearby trees. Thousands erupted into the air, their wings hissing like rain as they scattered through the tracer streams. Bodies thumped onto tarps and helmets as men ducked, cursing and laughing in equal measure at the absurdity of being dive-bombed by wildlife. One soldier later wrote home that the bats seemed angry, as if the war had finally annoyed even the animals. By the mid-1980s, PAVN strength in Cambodia reportedly settled around 140,000 troops, though the numbers fluctuated with gradual drawdowns and rotations. Khmer Rouge forces, along with the Khmer People's National Liberation Front and the Armée Nationale Sihanoukiste, maintained somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 fighters across border sanctuaries. The figures vary depending on who was counting and what they were counting: active combatants versus sympathizers, armed men versus logistic support. Historians continue debating the exact strength on both sides. In 1985, the PRK government launched the K5 Plan with Vietnamese oversight, a massive effort to lay mine belts and clear forest corridors along the Thai frontier. Workers swung machetes through resin-scented heat under vines thick with leeches, carving security zones through jungle that fought back with thorns and insects, and the kind of humid exhaustion that made men hallucinate. The mine belts were supposed to seal the border and cut the resistant supply lines. Instead, they created killing fields that would maim Cambodian farmers for decades after the war ended. Vietnamese soldiers wrote letters home on blue aerograms, the thin paper folding into its own envelope, their words censored, but the longing clear between the lines. They spoke of heat rashes that wouldn't heal, of jackfruit sweetness cutting through the stench of latrines, of the two-tone thunder of BM-21 Grad rocket salvos that shook bamboo walls even 3 to 4 kilometers away. The letters were fragments of experience compressed into a few paragraphs, trying to explain a war to families who couldn't understand why their sons and husbands were still fighting years after Saigon fell. A Vietnamese photographer processed film in a pagoda washroom, using rainwater collected in aluminum basins, the chemical developer mixing with monsoon runoff. One roll showed row after row of S-21 mugshots, the faces staring back at the developing light, with expressions ranging from confusion to terror to blank resignation. He filed the negatives carefully, knowing they were evidence but also wondering if anyone beyond the propaganda ministry would ever see them. Imagine yourself sweating through a 3-month rotation at an outpost where mortar rounds arrive with metronomic regularity, and the main question isn't if you'll go home but whether you'll walk out or be carried. In 1989, Vietnam announces full withdrawal, with the last units reportedly crossing back at Moc Bai on September 26th, soldiers describing the relief of red Cambodian dirt turning to the familiar green of Vietnamese rice paddies. But the road to that withdrawal was long, and it wasn't driven by military victory. By the mid to late 1980s, the occupation had become unsustainable. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev was pulling back from foreign commitments. The financial support that had kept Vietnamese forces supplied was drying up, and Hanoi's economy was buckling under the weight of maintaining over 100,000 troops in a foreign country while still rebuilding from decades of war at home. The world had isolated Vietnam diplomatically. The war wasn't being won, it was being endured, and endurance had limits. The guerrilla war ground on with no resolution in sight. Khmer Rouge fighters, reinforced by royalist and republican factions in an umbrella coalition called the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, continued hitting Vietnamese and PRK positions from sanctuaries across the Thai border. The resistance wasn't strong enough to retake the country, but it was strong enough to bleed the occupation indefinitely. Ambushes, mines, mortar attacks. The violence never reached the intensity of 1979, but it never stopped either. Vietnamese units that had rotated through Cambodia multiple times were exhausted. The troops who invaded in December 1978 were mostly veterans of the American War, men in their 30s and 40s by the late 80s. The replacements were younger, conscripts who'd grown up hearing stories about liberation and revolution, but found themselves patrolling hostile villages where old women spat at their feet and children scattered at their approach. Morale erosion was a slow poison that affected even disciplined units. International pressure mounted. The Paris peace process began taking shape in the late 80s, bringing together the PRK government, the resistance coalition, and regional powers in negotiations that would eventually lead to the 1991 Paris peace agreements. Vietnam's position was clear. They'd leave if a political settlement could prevent the Khmer Rouge from returning to power. The world's position was equally clear. Vietnam had to leave regardless. And what happened after was Cambodia's problem. The withdrawal began incrementally. Units pulled back from forward positions, consolidated into larger garrisons, handed over responsibilities to PRK forces that weren't always ready to assume them. The K5 mine belts that had been laid with such effort now became obstacles to withdrawal, requiring engineer teams to clear safe corridors for retreating columns. Some mines were mapped, many weren't. The clearing went slowly. Vietnamese advisors embedded in PRK ministries began packing files, destroying sensitive documents, preparing for a departure that many of their Cambodian counterparts viewed with barely concealed panic. Without Vietnamese military backing, could the PRK survive? Would the Khmer Rouge sweep back in? The advisors offered reassurances they didn't entirely believe themselves, promising continued support and training, while privately doubting the PRK's ability to stand alone. The final withdrawals in September 1989 had a surreal quality. Convoys rolled east toward the Vietnamese border, their route lined with civilians who watched silently, some relieved, some anxious, most simply uncertain about what came next. PRK soldiers stood at intersections in their new Chinese pattern uniforms, trying to project confidence while watching their guarantors disappear down the highway. The Vietnamese troops looked straight ahead, eager to be gone. Crossing back into Vietnam at Moc Bai, soldiers described a physical sensation of release, as if they'd been holding their breath for a decade and could finally exhale. The red laterite of Cambodia gave way to the green paddies of Thi Ninh province, the landscape shift marking more than geography. It was the boundary between occupation and home, between other people's war and their own country. Some men kissed the ground, others just lit cigarettes and stared at the horizon, processing the fact that they'd survived. The strategic outcome was mixed at best. Pol Pot had been toppled in 1979. That was undeniable. The PRK had been installed and survived, eventually transforming into the state of Cambodia and then the Kingdom of Cambodia under shifting political arrangements. But the cost was enormous. Sino-Vietnamese relations had ruptured completely, with the 1979 border war leaving scars that would take decades to heal. ASEAN cohesion had strengthened in opposition to Vietnamese intervention, isolating Hanoi diplomatically throughout the 1980s. The Cambodian conflict had become internationalized in ways Vietnam never intended. What started as a border dispute and punitive invasion became a proxy battlefield for Cold War tensions, with the Soviet Union backing Vietnam and the PRK, while China, the United States, and ASEAN nations supported the resistance coalition. The Paris peace agreements of 1991 finally ended the international dimension of the conflict, paving the way for UN peacekeepers and elections. But the settlement came 12 years after Vietnamese tanks first rolled into Phnom Penh. Vietnamese casualties remain disputed. Official figures were never fully released, and what numbers exist are considered unreliable by most historians. Estimates range from 10,000 to 50,000 killed over the course of the occupation, with many more wounded, missing, or permanently disabled. Disease killed as many as combat: malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and infections that turned minor wounds lethal. In the tropical climate, the psychological toll was harder to quantify but equally real. Vietnamese veterans remember Cambodia as the hot front after the American War, the war that came when they thought they were done fighting, the war that smelled of palm, sugar and decay, where firefights cracked at 200 meters in bamboo thickets and mines killed long after the guns fell silent. It was a war without a victory parade, without the clear moral framework of resisting foreign aggression, without the national unity that had sustained them through earlier conflicts. For many soldiers, Cambodia represented a betrayal of the sacrifices they'd already made. They'd fought the French, fought the Americans, reunified the country, and instead of peace they got another decade of jungle patrols and body bags. The government called it internationalist duty. The soldiers called it by other names, words spoken quietly among themselves, but never in official reports. The PRK survived Vietnamese withdrawal, but remained fragile. Hun Sen, who'd risen through the PRK hierarchy, would eventually dominate Cambodian politics for decades, navigating between former enemies and international pressure with a pragmatism that valued stability over ideology. The Khmer Rouge continued their insurgency through the 1990s, only fully collapsing after Pol Pot's death in 1998. The mines laid during the occupation and the subsequent civil war would kill and maim Cambodians well into the 21st century. Vietnam gained little from the invasion in tangible terms. They'd eliminated a hostile regime on their border, true, but at the cost of international isolation, economic strain, and thousands of lives. The generation that fought in Cambodia came home to a country struggling with joy moi economic reforms, where their service was acknowledged but not celebrated, filed away as a necessary chapter in revolutionary history that was best not examined too closely. Imagine yourself in that convoy crossing at Mok Bai, watching Cambodia recede in the dust behind you, and wondering if any of it, any of the years, the patrols, the friends who didn't make it, actually mattered in the end. A Piavan captain finds a child's notebook in a Kompong Chum schoolhouse dated Year 0, Year 3, in Khmer Rouge calendar notation, the arithmetic problems corrected in red ink and then stopping abruptly mid-page as if the teacher simply vanished. Wars leave ruins you can photograph, collapsed bridges, bullet-scarred walls, burnt-out tanks rusting in rice paddies. But the deeper wreckage is human, written in bodies that survived but never fully healed, in minds that couldn't forget, in families fractured across borders and decades. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia toppled a genocidal regime, but it also created new categories of victims. Soldiers who fought a war their country barely acknowledged, Cambodians caught between competing visions of liberation and occupation, families scattered to refugee camps who would spend years in limbo waiting for resettlement or return. The PRK government restored the Gregorian calendar and reopened schools in the early 1980s, trying to rebuild an educational system the Khmer Rouge had deliberately destroyed. Teachers taught Khmer script to classes, sitting on woven mats in buildings where chalk dust mixed with kerosene lamp smoke. Many of the students were older than typical elementary ages, teenagers learning to read for the first time, their childhoods erased by 4 years of agricultural labour camps. The teachers themselves were often barely educated, anyone with literacy pressed into service because the Khmer Rouge had murdered most of the country's intellectuals. Children who'd grown up under the Khmer Rouge carried traumas that would shape Cambodia for generations. They'd watched parents executed for minor infractions, been separated from families and sent to work brigades, learned that emotion was dangerous and silence was survival. When the PRK tried to implement normal schooling, teachers encountered students who flinched at raised voices, who hoarded food, who couldn't understand why learning was valuable when the previous regime had punished education with death. Vietnamese soldiers faced their own psychological aftermath. Many had suppressed the violence they'd witnessed during the invasion and occupation, compartmentalizing horror to function in combat. Back in Vietnam, those compartments began leaking. Nightmares of Tuol Sleng, of villages they'd pacified with methods that troubled their conscience, of friends killed by mines while walking point. The government offered no counselling, no recognition of combat trauma. Revolutionary soldiers were supposed to be resilient, shaped by political consciousness into men who didn't break. The reality was different. Some veterans spoke quietly among themselves about what they'd seen, not the official narrative of liberation, but the uglier truths. The villages they'd burned because they might have sheltered guerrillas, the prisoners they'd mistreated during interrogations, the casual looting that happened, when soldiers were underpaid and undersupplied. These weren't official war crimes in any prosecutable sense, but they weighed on consciences nonetheless, the small moral erosions that accumulate in any occupation. Ethnic Vietnamese who'd returned to Cambodia under PRK protection lived in a state of permanent anxiety. When Vietnam withdrew, they lost their guarantors. Khmer Rouge propaganda had always portrayed them as foreign colonizers, and that rhetoric didn't disappear with the Paris peace agreements. Periodic violence against Vietnamese communities erupted through the 1990s, forcing many to flee back to Vietnam or into refugee camps, their second displacement in as many decades. The mine contamination was staggering. The K5 plan alone had laid thousands of mines along the Thai border, but those were just additions to minefields the Khmer Rouge had seeded, French colonial-era munitions still buried from earlier conflicts, and American cluster bombs that had been dropped during the secret bombing campaigns of the early 1970s. Cambodia became one of the world's most heavily mined countries, with amputees a common sight in every provincial town. Demining efforts began in the early 1990s, but proceeded slowly, hampered by lack of funding, incomplete maps, and the sheer scale of contamination. Farmers working their fields would trigger mines decades after they'd been laid. Children playing in forests found unexploded ordnance that looked like toys. The demining dog Vang had saved his platoon, but Cambodia needed thousands like him and didn't have them. Refugee camps along the Thai border became semi-permanent cities. Khao Ai Dang, at its peak, held over 100,000 people living in bamboo shelters, their status perpetually temporary, even as years stretched into decades. International organizations provided food and basic services, but camp life created its own pathologies: enforced idleness, factional violence between resistance groups, sexual exploitation, and the slow corrosion of hope that comes from being neither here nor there, suspended in bureaucratic limbo while the world decides your fate. Many refugees were eventually resettled in third countries: the United States, France, Australia, Canada. They carried Cambodia with them in ways both visible and invisible. The older generation tried to preserve language and culture. The younger generation struggled between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Khmer neighborhoods in Long Beach and Lowell became diaspora centers, preserving a version of Cambodia that existed before the Khmer Rouge, while the country itself evolved in different directions. For Vietnamese veterans, coming home meant confronting a society that had moved on. While they'd been fighting in Cambodia, Vietnam had begun Joy Moi reforms, opening to market economics, trying to escape the economic stagnation that decades of war had created. The veterans' skills, jungle navigation, weapons maintenance, small unit tactics, had little application in a peacetime economy desperate for engineers and entrepreneurs. Many struggled to reintegrate, finding work where they could, rarely speaking about their service. The government awarded medals and certificates, held official ceremonies on liberation anniversaries, but the public attention was perfunctory. Cambodia wasn't the great patriotic war against America. It was the awkward conflict that came after, the one that had isolated Vietnam internationally and drained resources needed at home. Veterans learned not to talk about it much. Their service was acknowledged but not celebrated, filed away in the national memory as necessary but uncomfortable. Some veterans returned to Cambodia years later as tourists, visiting the places they'd fought, trying to make peace with their memories. They found a country transformed, Phnom Penh rebuilt with investment. From the same countries that had opposed Vietnam's invasion, the PRK government evolved into something more complex and corrupt. The Khmer Rouge finally dissolved, but many of its mid-level cadres integrated into Cambodian society through various amnesty arrangements. The war they'd fought seemed simultaneously recent and impossibly distant. The children in those reopened schools grew up, some becoming the next generation of Cambodian leadership, others part of the diaspora, many simply trying to build ordinary lives in a country still processing extraordinary trauma. They inherited a nation shaped by genocide, invasion, occupation, civil war, and fragile peace, layers of violence that would take generations to fully process, if such processing were even possible. Imagine yourself holding that child's notebook, arithmetic problems frozen mid-page, and wondering what happened to the student who never got to finish the lesson. Vietnamese veterans remember Cambodia as the war that smelled of palm sugar and decay, where firefights cracked at 200 meters in bamboo and mines killed long after the guns fell silent. The hot front after the American war that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The invasion that began on December 25, 1978, achieved its immediate military objective within 2 weeks. Phnom Penh fell, the Khmer Rouge scattered, and a new government was installed. By that narrow measure, it was a success. But wars are measured not just by territorial gains or regime changes, but by their long-term consequences. And by that standard, the verdict is far more complicated. Vietnam spent a decade occupying Cambodia, losing thousands of soldiers, straining its economy to breaking point, and earning international condemnation that isolated Hanoi diplomatically through most of the 1980s. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 removed Vietnam's main patron and forced a fundamental reassessment of foreign policy. The invasion had been justified as internationalist solidarity, fraternal assistance to liberate Cambodia from genocide. The reality was messier, a mixture of genuine humanitarian concern, legitimate security fears about Khmer Rouge cross-border raids, and regional power politics in a Cold War context. The PRK government that Vietnam installed survived and evolved, eventually becoming the State of Cambodia and then the Kingdom of Cambodia through the UN-supervised transition of the early 1990s. Hun Sen, who started as a low-ranking PRK official, dominated Cambodian politics for decades, creating a system that was neither the revolutionary socialism Vietnam had envisioned, nor the liberal democracy the international community hoped for. Cambodia found its own path, shaped by the invasion but not defined by it. The Khmer Rouge remained a factor in Cambodian politics far longer than anyone expected. Despite military defeat in 1979, they waged guerrilla war through the 1990s, sustained by Chinese and Thai support and international recognition at the United Nations. Pol Pot died in 1998 in a Khmer Rouge jungle camp, never facing trial for the genocide. Many of his subordinates were eventually integrated into Cambodian society through amnesty deals, a pragmatic choice that prioritized stability over justice, but left many survivors feeling betrayed. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, didn't begin trials until 2006, nearly 3 decades after the regime fell. By then, most senior leaders were dead or too old to stand trial. The proceedings convicted a handful of officials for crimes against humanity, genocide, and other charges, but the limited scope meant that thousands of perpetrators were never held accountable. Justice delayed became justice denied for many victims. For the Cambodian people, the Vietnamese invasion remains deeply contested memory. Some view it as liberation that ended genocide and allowed the country to begin rebuilding. Others see it as the start of a decade-long foreign occupation that replaced one form of control with another. Both perspectives contain truth. The invasion stopped the killing fields, but the occupation that followed wasn't purely humanitarian. It served Vietnamese strategic interests and came with significant costs for Cambodian sovereignty. The generational divide is stark. Older Cambodians who survived the Khmer Rouge years tend to view the invasion more favorably, remembering the relief when Vietnamese troops arrived and life slowly normalized. Younger Cambodians who grew up hearing nationalist narratives about foreign occupation may view it more critically, focused on Vietnamese control rather than liberation from the Khmer Rouge. These competing memories shape Cambodian politics and identity decades later. Vietnam's relationship with its Cambodian war remains equally complex. Official histories emphasize the humanitarian mission and friendship between peoples. Veteran accounts are more ambiguous, mixing pride in toppling a genocidal regime with frustration about the cost, the lack of public recognition, and the sense that they fought for goals that were never fully achieved. The war doesn't occupy the same space in Vietnamese national consciousness as the resistance against French colonialism or the American War. It's acknowledged but not celebrated, remembered but not mythologized. Sino-Vietnamese relations, ruptured by the invasion and the subsequent border war, took decades to normalize. Border demarcation wasn't fully resolved until the late 1990s. Trade and diplomatic ties gradually resumed, but deep suspicion remained. China's support for the Khmer Rouge during the 1980s left scars on both sides. The relationship eventually stabilized into pragmatic cooperation between communist parties, but the warmth of the 1950s and 60s never returned. The mine contamination persisted into the 21st century. Despite extensive demoning efforts, Cambodia still had thousands of square kilometers of mined land, decades after the conflicts ended. Farmers continued to be killed and maimed. Children still found cluster bomblets that looked like toys. The physical legacy of multiple wars, the American bombing, the Khmer Rouge minefields, the K5 plan, the subsequent civil war, created a layered contamination that would take generations to fully clear. The refugee experience shaped the Cambodian diaspora in profound ways. Families resettled in Western countries maintained ties to Cambodia, sending remittances, visiting when possible, preserving culture through community organizations and Buddhist temples. The second generation grew up between worlds, often more comfortable in English or French than Khmer, navigating between parents who carried trauma and a broader society that often knew little about Cambodia beyond the killing fields. The diaspora became its own Cambodia, parallel to the one evolving in Southeast Asia. For historians, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia presents complex questions about intervention, sovereignty, and the responsibility to protect. Vietnam acted unilaterally without UN authorization, violating international norms against aggressive war. Yet the invasion stopped an ongoing genocide that the international community had failed to address. This tension between legal principle and moral outcome continues to fuel academic debate. Was it justified intervention or illegal aggression? Can both be true simultaneously? The war's environmental impact received less attention but was significant. Agent Orange and other defoliants used during the American War contaminated areas that Vietnamese and Cambodian troops then fought over. Artillery cratering damaged watersheds. The K5 plan's forest clearing along the border destroyed habitat and disrupted ecosystems. Wars leave ecological scars that outlast political settlements, affecting land and water for decades. Medical consequences extended beyond combat casualties. Malaria rates spiked during the occupation as troop movements spread mosquito vectors. Cholera and dysentery epidemics killed thousands of civilians in the immediate post-invasion period. Tuberculosis flourished in refugee camps. The public health crisis created by war and displacement had mortality effects that rivaled combat deaths, though these casualties rarely appear in official tallies. The economic cost to Vietnam was enormous and still debated by economists. Maintaining over 100,000 troops in Cambodia, while simultaneously defending the northern border against China, drained resources that could have gone to post-war reconstruction. The international isolation meant lost trade and investment opportunities. Some economists argue the Cambodian occupation delayed Vietnam's economic development by a decade. Others contend the security threat from the Khmer Rouge justified the expenditure. The counterfactual, what would have happened without the invasion, remains unknowable. Ultimately, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia was a war without clear winners. The Khmer Rouge fell but wasn't destroyed. Cambodia was liberated but then occupied. Vietnam achieved security on its southwestern border but at tremendous cost. The international community condemned the invasion while simultaneously benefiting from the end of genocide. Everyone lost something. Some gained something. History's judgment remains divided. The soldiers who fought it carry the weight still. They're old men now, the ones who survived, gathering occasionally at veteran associations, comparing notes about heat and mines and the friends who didn't come home. Their war remains the uncomfortable one, the conflict that came when they thought they'd earned peace, the invasion that saved lives and took others, the occupation that neither liberated nor conquered, but did something more ambiguous in between.